It's a real pleasure to introduce Stuart Wright. Stuart and I go back a long way. We were colleagues at Lamar University back in the Paleolithic era. And Stuart has stayed. He's a fabulous scholar. He has not only written at length about the Branch Davidian tragedy, but he has written about other similar events. He writes about new religious movements. He's a top 5 scholar, and it's really, really great to have Stuart here with us today. Please welcome Stuart Wright.
Good afternoon. I hope you're not falling asleep yet. There's a Starbucks next door. Like you, I was listening with rapt attention to Gary Nessner, and gosh, I wanted to respond to some of the things he was saying. I thought, in hindsight now, it would have been great to have a panel, of some of us up here, so we could both respond to Q&A and have a little back and forth. As my presentation, you're going to find out real quickly, we'll probably have some disagreement on some points, but not surprising in the context of a conference that the scholars and others would disagree, experts. I'm going to focus on the role of militarization. The federal siege of the Branch Davidian community has attracted substantial attention, obviously, by journalists, legal scholars, religious historians, social scientists, and so forth, over the last 20 years. But one feature of this tragedy, I think, has yet to be fully explored, and it draws me in a way that I can't seem to get over. So here I'm referring mainly to this martial logic that was used by federal agents beginning with the ATF. And so I pose this question to you, and I've divided it into 2 parts. One is, why did the ATF move forward with a military-like raid, even though safer and less lethal options were known to be available after a 2-month surveillance and undercover operation? And then secondly, why did the FBI HRT continue a sustained military approach to the siege during the standoff, culminating in the CS gas attack that resulted in mass casualties? Paramilitary raids by special operations units are ordinarily reserved for violent drug traffickers or terrorist organizations, maybe criminal gangs. The Branch Davidians were none of these. Yet the actions taken by federal law enforcement were tantamount to a counter-terrorism strike, transforming Mount Carmel Center into a battleground, a theater of war. In the aftermath of the initial raid by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the incident was allowed to escalate into a final reckoning, leading to the deaths of 76 men, women, and children. The FBI's hostage rescue team determined that after a 51-day standoff, negotiations had failed and launched the CS gas attack, breaching the Mount Carmel Center with 29 feet long, 52-ton M60 tanks and firing ferret rounds into the structure to allegedly force the barricaded second members out. 6 hours later, the building erupted into a fiery inferno, killing most of the residents. The death toll included 21 children, 12 of them under the age of 5. More than 60% of the residents at Mount Carmel were women, children, and elderly persons. One of the most confounding questions surrounding Mount Carmel is why a relatively small, benign religious sect would evoke such an aggressive and sustained military-like response from authorities. Research now shows that the ATF developed an exaggerated perception of the Branch Davidians as an ominous threat to society and to themselves. As a result of this distorted perception, federal agents discarded a safer and less lethal means of enforcement and chose to conduct a dangerous, high-risk, dynamic entry. The dynamic entry, a curious euphemism, was carried out by the ATF's Special Response Team and planned with military assistance by the U.S. Army Special Forces Rapid Support Unit at Fort Hood and 3 days of training in close quarters combat exercises. The raid plan was given the code name Operation Trojan Horse. The raid team involved a force of 80 federal agents outfitted in full camouflage and combat gear, Kevlar helmets and flak jackets, armed with MP5 submachine guns, semi-automatic AR-15 rifles, 6-hour 9mm semi-automatic pistols, 308 caliber high-power sniper rifles, shotguns, and concussion grenades. The raid team was hidden in cattle drivers pulled by pickup trucks and disguised by tarps on the morning of February 28th. The objective of the raid was to execute a search and arrest warrant for David Koresh, the sect leader, for violations of federal firearms laws and possession of a destructive device. As we later learned, the element of surprise was lost. An undercover agent, Robert Rodriguez, was inside Mount Carmel at that time and was aware that Davidians had been informed of the impending raid. Agent Rodriguez advised ATF commanders to call off the raid. They ignored the agent's advice and proceeded with the raid. Accounts differ about who fired first, but a shootout ensued. 6 sect members and 4 federal agents were mortally wounded, and this began the 51-day standoff that we now know so well about. Subsequent investigations by congressional committees revealed that the initial ATF raid was severely flawed and unnecessary. One of the justifications for the raid given by ATF was predicated on the claim that David Koresh never left Mount Carmel and could not be apprehended away from the property. That claim proved to be false. In fact, Koresh left on numerous occasions during a 2-month ATF surveillance and undercover operation. And on at least one occasion, Koresh jogged up and down Double E Ranch Road directly in front of the undercover houses. The failure to apprehend Koresh was cited as a critical flaw in the final report by the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight and the Committee on the Judiciary. They held hearings in Waco in the summer of 1995. I worked with both of those committees. I testified the first day of the hearings, and I stayed about half of the time of the hearings, which lasted 12 days. In this report, it states, quote, David Koresh could have been arrested outside the Davidian compound. The ATF chose not to arrest Koresh and instead was determined to use a dynamic entry approach. In making this decision, ATF agents exercised extremely poor judgment, made erroneous assumptions, and ignored the foreseeable perils of their course of action, end quote. One of the principal insights that came out of the 1993 Department of Treasury report, issued a few months after the ill-fated raid, was that the ATF seemed to make decisions that put both agents and citizens in harm's way unnecessarily. The Treasury report notes that the ATF failed to consider its options and describes the planning of the operation as, quote, steps taken along what seemed at the time to be a preordained road, end quote. The House Congressional Report in 1996 makes this point even more forcefully about the preordained road characterization. It states, quote, the decision to pursue a military-style raid was made more than 2 months before surveillance, undercover, and infiltration efforts were begun. I think that deserves repeating one more time. The decision to pursue a military-style raid was made more than 2 months before surveillance, undercover, and infiltration efforts were even begun. It appears that ATF officials were determined to conduct a paramilitary raid, irrespective of intelligence operations that showed Koresh could be apprehended away from Mount Carmel, or that the element of surprise had been lost only minutes before the incursion. The report went on to castigate the ATF, these are their words, not mine, for a grossly incompetent investigation, citing an incredible number of false statements in the affidavit accompanying the warrants, and for misrepresenting to Defense Department officials that the branch Davidians were involved in illegal drug manufacturing in order to obtain military support and training, end quote. They were not involved in drug manufacturing. The only way they could obtain military assistance was to claim a drug nexus. We learned later that The previous owner, George Roden, apparently had a meth lab in there, but Sheriff Harwell came out when the Branch Davidians moved back in after their short time in Palestine. They moved back to Mount Carmel. They reported this to the sheriff's office. They came in and cleaned it up. End of story. Had nothing to do with David Koresh and his group. They knew that to be true, actually. They asked an ex-member by the name of Mark Groh to send them some information in a fax. And Mark Groh openly talks about this in his own book and provides us with that information. Thank you. Because ATF falsely claimed a drug nexus, it enjoyed extensive military assistance and cooperation in the planning of the Operation Trojan Horse. Counter-drug National Guard units in January and February of 1993 conducted surveillance overflights of Mount Carmel in UC-26 aircraft equipped with infrared cameras, FLIR. The ATF's paramilitary response team trained with active military personnel in the planning and rehearsal of the proposed takedown, their words, not mine. In addition to the close quarters combat exercises already mentioned, training included company-level tactical CT, medical evaluation training, techniques for treating battlefield injury, assistance with range and mount military operation on urban terrain. And on February 28th, the day of the raid, Texas National Guard supplied 10 counter-drug personnel and 3 helicopters, 2 OH-58s and 1 UH-60 Blackhawk. ATF's stated mission to the National Guard officially was to use the helicopters as a command and control platform during the raid and to transport personnel and evidence to the area after it was secured. Only after the National Guard arrived at Fort Hood did they learn that hours before the raid, did ATF agents inform them that the helicopters would be deployed as an aerial diversion during the raid. So this brings us to, among other things, why? My own research and others, such as John Hall and some of his colleagues, suggest that the ATF garnered a greatly exaggerated and sinister image of threat posed by the Branch Davidians and became convinced, though it may have been convenient to do so, that the threat was real. This can be directly linked to the agency's sources of information. A loose oppositional coalition of disgruntled ex-members led by a man named Mark Groh, anti-cult organizations and actors, and concerned family members who lobbied federal law enforcement and persuaded them of their claims. In effect, I argue that a potent script emerged from a convergence of narratives among the cultural opponents of Koresh, allied with public agencies that served to consolidate the mutual interests of both law enforcement and Davidian antagonists. In the emergent play of cultural meanings, an overarching warfare narrative was constructed that depicted the Davidians as an armed, apocalyptic cult preparing for a final battle with the Antichrist government forces. The convergence of narratives in which the theme of warfare was central helps explain the mentality of federal officials that led to excessive force demonstrated at Mount Carmel. As such, it was not simply the weapons violations that moved federal officials to a full-blown paramilitary plan of attack, but also the imputed link to a warfare narrative that fueled an inflated image of threat. Federal agents became convinced that the Davidians would not cooperate in an investigation. ATF investigator David Aguilera refused an invitation by David Koresh to inspect his weapons at Mount Carmel several months before the raid, and which the congressional report later called a serious mistake. They were convinced that they hated the federal government, were controlled by a fanatical cult leader that would launch a holy war against anybody who challenged. And what shapes and frames this warrior cult motif in the affidavit accompanying the warrants are the accounts by ex-members and detractors who provided ATF investigator Aguilera with menacing descriptions of life at Mount Carmel. Here one finds stories of armed sentries, paramilitary maneuvers and training, weapons stockpiles, shoot-to-kill orders regarding intruders, discussions of imminent war, contingency plans for mass suicide, and the group's purported hatred of the government. Without these lurid and dramatic tropes to magnify the alleged threat, posed by the Davidians, it is questionable that the ATF would have taken such extreme measures in the planning and implementation of such a militarized raid. ATF officials made the critical mistake of basing its investigation on unreliable sources. Information supplied by adversaries and opponents of Koresh who were engaged in a moral campaign to repudiate the sect leader and his movement. These were not objective and impartial sources. One of the experts who served in the Treasury Department's review panel, New York Police Department Lieutenant Robert Zabitsky, wrote, and I'm quoting him, "Former cult members were interviewed and apparently much, if not all, of their statements are reported to be facts. No thought is given to the idea that these ex-members had been away from the residence for some time, or to their individual biases, or if they had an axe to grind with present members," end quote. It may also be argued that ATF officials were predisposed to believe these exaggerated claims because it served their own interests. The new Clinton administration, which took office in January 1993, was determined to push through tighter gun controls, making ATF the greatest beneficiary of the new gun control policies. Officials in the Bureau were certainly aware of the changing political climate in Washington, D.C. You may or may not remember that the previous administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, both of these presidents were card-carrying NRA members. They were friendly to gun owners and they were friendly to the gun lobby. The Clinton administration, on the other hand, pressed Congress to pass the Brady Bill and later the 1994 Federal Crime Bill, which outlawed 17 types of assault weapons. Moreover, Bill Clinton had been the governor of Arkansas during the federal siege of the violent Christian identity group, the Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord. We talked about the success that, Gary talked about the success that the HRT had in Arkansas in 1985, but the resentment that built around that success was a defeat for the Patriot movement and patriots. We oftentimes forget that the governor of Arkansas at that time was Mr. Clinton himself, who was then blamed or scapegoated. It's possible that Clinton may have been seen by ATF officials as more sympathetic to a similar enforcement action 8 years later in Waco as the new president took office. The affinity between the ATF's mission and the new administration's preference for reducing violent crime through heightened gun controls was clear. Given the timing of the raid and the decision to pursue a military-style raid more than 2 months before surveillance, undercover, and infiltration efforts were begun, the grossly incompetent investigation, the incredible number of false statements in the affidavit, and the ATF commander's decision to proceed with the raid on the morning of February 28, even after the element of surprise was lost, at least suggests that a compelling argument can be made here for institutional self-interest. After the ATF raid, the FBI's hostage rescue team was called in to take control of the standoff. Apparently, the warfare narrative constructed by the ATF then was received by the FBI without much critical analysis. The HRT, which the FBI describes as its crack counterterrorism unit, brought in Bradley fighting vehicles, M1 Abrams tanks, M60 tanks from Fort Hood, and it positioned snipers on 2 sides of the Mount Carmel Center. And as early as March 17th, the HRT implemented a psychological warfare strategy to, in the words of the FBI, quote, drive a wedge between Koresh and his followers. I heard Gary say earlier that the goal and objective of hostage negotiators is to de-escalate the situation. Right? But we see here in the FBI log that the commanders on the ground began a program of stress escalation. How do you balance stress escalation with de-escalation? Psychological warfare is a strategy developed by the CIA which involves alternating gestures of conciliation and threat in order to confuse a designated enemy. It is designed to induce acute emotional stress, fear, distrust, and sleep deprivation, among other things. And as such, the FBI used heavy-duty stadium lights at Mount Carmel to disrupt sleep. They played recorded sounds of dentist drills and rabbits being slaughtered, and played them at decibels so loud they posed a risk of hearing loss, particularly among the children. Members of the Delta Force, the U.S. Army Special Operations Unit, was present at Mount Carmel, as were foreign military personnel, and the congressional report documents that the members of the 22nd Regiment of the British Special Air Service were on the grounds at Mount Carmel. The SAS, we're told, possess special tactical military skills and has a role similar to the U.S. Army Special Forces troops. The presence of a strong counterterrorism voice at Mount Carmel helps to explain the preference of the FBI commanders for a military or tactical solution to the standoff. Despite protests from the negotiators who wanted to stay with negotiations, indeed, we know now that some of the provocative actions by the HRT command and tactical personnel undermined and sabotaged the negotiations. The Davidians came to believe that the FBI was negotiating in bad faith. Gestures of conciliation were followed with threatening and aggressive gestures, running over the graves of the members of the Davidians they had buried just outside of Mount Carmel, crushing Davidian cars with tanks, crushing the children's toys, turning off their electricity, in effect punishing them when they responded positively to the negotiators' overtures and requests. Then, citing a breakdown in negotiations, which the FBI helped to create, on the morning of April 19th, the HRT laid siege to the Mount Carmel Center, breaching the building and firing ferret rounds of dangerous CS gas. After 6 hours, we know, the fire broke out and engulfed the building, killing 76 people. Photos of the military tanks surrounding the embattled sect members in a deadly carnage was viewed by millions of people, both here and abroad. I was speaking with someone earlier. It's now been 20 years since this happened, and when I go abroad to present a paper or attend a conference in, I don't know, London or Berlin, Paris, Milan, I've published 3 books since this book that I did on Waco in 1995. But guess what they want to talk about all over the world? They want to talk about this. It astounds people outside of the boundaries of the United States how we got here. And they seem pretty perplexed by it. The impact of Waco on American culture has been substantial and it's been very far-reaching. Waco has become a symbol of government overreach and excessive force. It served to galvanize the militia and patriot movements of the 1990s. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995 by Timothy McVeigh and fellow insurgents was carried out in retaliation for Waco. I was hired by Timothy McVeigh's lead defense attorney, Stephen Jones, to work on the McVeigh case. I met Tim McVeigh. I got to know Tim McVeigh. I spent about 10 hours with him face to face. We talked extensively about Waco. Waco wasn't the only reason he bombed the Murrah Building. It so happens that April 19, 1995 was the 10-year anniversary of the FBI siege on the Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord in Arkansas. It had double Guantanamo. But he was clearly outraged by Waco. Tim was here. Tim came to the standoff during the 51-day standoff. He was here. We now know that because he got his photo taken and he was interviewed by a campus news reporter from SMU. He watched those tanks roll in, right, to Mount Carmel. Now, Tim McVeigh was a soldier. He was a gunner on a tank in Desert Storm and was awarded a number of medals for his service. But when he saw those tanks come in, he knew. He told his friends, and he told me. He said, "I know those people are going to die." Waco is now an historical marker, a permanent part of the far-right political culture's identity and reason to be. And not surprisingly, with the election of the liberal Democratic President Barack Obama, who recruited many former Clinton advisors to his administration, the paranoid fear of the far right has returned in greater numbers with record levels now of new militia and patriot groups. And we also see record sales of guns and ammunition accompanying the resurgence of this patriot movement. It's not difficult to gauge how Waco influences current politics and policy. The sharply divided gun control debates we're having today are shaped in perhaps ways we are not aware by Waco. Conservatives and gun right groups are always talking about the fear of disarmament. They're afraid that government is going to try and take their guns away. These Second Amendment fundamentalists say they need access to assault weapons and large magazines or unlimited ammunition to protect themselves, not from criminals. The National Rifle Association and the gun lobby has dropped that argument altogether. What you hear now today is that they need large magazines and assault weapons to protect themselves against their government. Now, where do you think they got a crazy idea like that? To many people, this sounds irrational and absurd, but if you listen closely to what they're saying, they are invoking Waco. They're holding up Waco as a history lesson. And let's not forget, Waco was a gun raid. It was a gun raid that ended in the worst law enforcement disaster in American history. It was the paranoid gun enthusiast's worst nightmare. And it occurred on the heels of another misguided gun raid in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, 6 months earlier, which you've heard mentioned a couple times today. One of the primary reasons we cannot get reasonable gun control laws passed through Congress right now, even in the wake of horrific mass shootings at Virginia Tech, Aurora, Tucson, and Newtown, Connecticut, is because of what happened in Waco 20 years ago. At their peril, politicians and policymakers dismiss the Branch Davidian tragedy as some kind of aberration or unfortunate incident in the past that has no pressing relevance today. But Waco is the subtext of conservative and far-right resistance to gun control. Before we laugh and dismiss these people as crazy, think about what took place there. Waco was and still is a very polarizing subject. Democrats and progressives saw the appropriation of Waco during the Clinton years as an appropriation by right-wing leaders, as a thinly veiled assault on liberalism in the context of culture wars. And I think they were right. Keep in mind that only a year after Waco, in 1994, conservative Republicans swept into power, seized a majority in both houses of Congress. The Waco hearings in the summer of 1995 were heated and bitterly contentious. Not unlike other contested actions of government, such as the Iraqi War, perhaps, or extraordinary renditions of Guantanamo, or even the Patriot Act. Explanations tend to entail coded interpretations of ideological canons or principles. The debates surrounding gun control are replete with coded messages about Waco. On Monday, a Reuters news report announced that House Republicans were looking to weaken an already tepid effort at background checks coming out of the Senate. The first paragraph of the news story read as follows. As the U.S. Senate prepares to debate a gun control bill for the first time in 20 years, on Monday, Republicans in the House are devising ways to delay and weaken legislation they see as limiting Americans' right to bear arms. Some Republican lawmakers and strategists are urging Speaker John Boehner to kill any gun control passed by the Senate by refusing even to take action on it. The report went on to say that some amendments introduced by Democrats, ban on assault weapons or limiting large capacity magazines, had little chance of succeeding. Yesterday I watched a CNN report in which I learned that the Senate had refused to crack any kind of bill coming out of that House with regard to even universal background checks. So let me conclude by saying, I think without fully understanding the deeper and very far-reaching cultural significance of Waco, I don't think we can ever move forward on reasonable gun control legislation and common sense measures on gun safety without a broader appreciation of the symbolism of the militarized siege and the deadly carnage at Mount Carmel 20 years ago. I'm afraid we are hopelessly mired in a different kind of standoff regarding gun control debates. Thank you.
Stuart has gone so fast, we're going to actually take a few questions before we take a 15-minute break. And Leon has a microphone, so if you have a question, raise your hand. Just one here, and then we'll go over here.
Could you go into more detail about what one hears the FBI going into the gun dealer's shop and Koresh being gotten on the telephone? He invited them to come to Mount Carmel and show them, and why didn't they take him up on that?
Yeah, the branch Davidians were dealing with this man named Henry McMahon, who was a gun dealer here in Waco. And anytime you have these kinds of communal organizations or groups, if they don't want their members working outside the community, but they like to keep them inside for religious reasons. I mean, history of Protestantism is a history of separatism, right? Sectarian movements and separatist groups. So they were trying to create streams of revenue, right? And they came across the idea that they could sell guns, buy guns wholesale, sell them retail at gun shows. By the way, I've learned a lot about gun shows in the last 10 years. 5 million people a year attend gun shows in the United States. And there is at least one gun show, even in the state of Texas, every weekend of the year. So it's a thriving industry, and they thought that that was a stream of revenue for them. The ATF agent who was in charge of the investigation, David Aguilera, went to see Mr. McMahon in making inquiries about the guns that he was selling them and that they were buying. And Henry went in, during the course of this conversation, he excused himself, went into the back room, picked up the phone, called David, of course, and said, I've got an ATF agent here who's making inquiries about your gun purchases. And he said, well, let me talk to him. He can come out and look at the weapons. And Mr. McMahon handed the phone to David Aguilera, offered it to him anyway, and he did this. Said, I don't need to talk to him. The ATF never went out to the property to inspect the weapons. The only time that they ever entered the property was on February 28th when they conducted their raid.
And isn't that the time when they could have subpoenaed him, or?
I think that's clear in the congressional report that, and the congressional report doesn't mince words here. It said that it was a grievous mistake and that they should take advantage of the invitation
Is
to the
there any
property.
excuse for it? Was there any excuse they were offered for why the agents turned down the invitation?
Well,
Is there a reason why they turned down the invitation?
see, my argument is that in trying to understand this characterization of the ATF's raid as something that was steps taken along what seemed to be a preordained road implies that they'd already made their decision to take a certain kind of action. That nothing they found in their undercover intelligence operations, surveillance operations, that would have told them that they could have conducted this law enforcement action differently seemed to divert them from their preordained road, and that was to conduct a military raid.
Yes. I just wanted to ask, is there something that can be said on interest groups such as the NRA making money off of other people's fears and encouraging their fears, and the money that is made by others giving talks, giving speeches, encouraging others in their fear of something like the government taking their guns, something like the government taking over. What do you have to say to that?
I'm not sure I understand your question, so ask me again, if you would.
What do you have to say to the fact that the NRA seems to be encouraging people's fears and actually making money off of people's fears? And there's speeches that can.
Is that a rhetorical question?
Yeah.
Is the NRA being opportunistic and
Yes.
being able to elevate people's fears as they go out and buy more guns?
Because there's money to be made. There's money to be made to give a speech and say, okay, this is true. This is, you know.
And more so true of assault weapons than just say handguns. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that? I mean, because I kind of felt that you had the position of the NRA. What do you have to say against a spectator that says, okay, there's money to be made here. People are making money doing this. People are making money saying this. So they're going to say this. They're going to do this. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I would say that if you look at the polling that's been done, even among NRA members, that must support universal background checks, even the majority support limitation on assault weapons and magazine rounds. So it makes me think that we're not even talking about the members of the NRA, but maybe just the leadership who may have benefited most financially from the money that flows from gun manufacturers.
Is that here and then one back?
Okay, yeah, let me tell you from my point of view. I spent 20 years working in the United States Penitentiary, Florence, Colorado. Google it sometime. You'll find it's at the top of the food chain of assaults and criminals. Now, unlike those people that got burned up, let's be honest, at Waco, were essentially minding their own business. As you have said before, that there were ample opportunities to take Koresh prior to this happening, and yet the government came down on their heads. You're talking about gun control laws. You're talking about crimes that are committed by a very few number of weapons in the total universe of murders and crimes committed in this country are done by assault rifles. If you're to do it properly, you should look at the demographics of where these crimes happen, because I can assure you that most of these crimes happen in inner cities. It is an urban problem and a cultural problem. It is not the problem of John Q. Public, who minds his own darn business, pays his taxes, and behaves himself. And believe me, this is my experience having to deal with people at the top end of crime. And it is not a general problem in the American society. It is a problem of specific groups in this society. So, what do you think of that, sir?
I didn't want to take away from my initial argument. I was trying to make a point that Waco still has an influence on our politics and our policy 20 years hence in ways that we may not fully understand. And so I went to the gun control debates as an example of how that's done. I didn't really want to get into the gun control debate per se.
Last question. You did. Last question.
I did.
In the back.
Yeah, I came to Waco talking about gun control. Man, did I hit a hornet's nest, right?
Yes, sir. I have been working with in a state prison for the last 27 years of my life also, so I'm a little bit used to dealing with some of the worst of society's people. I'm a little bit flustered by one of the questions that were asked earlier. He said that NRA and these organizations like them are building on fears. We just talked about the fears for over an hour of what happened because of government overreach. Hello. Open your eyes, people. The government is the biggest danger in all history. More millions reach of government than any terrorist movement ever in history. That is so important, and why you can close your eyes to that, I just can't understand. But I did want to point that out, and I thank you for giving me an opportunity.
So that wasn't a question, that was a comment, okay. Is that it?
Let's thank Stuart for a great presentation. We'll take a 15-minute break. Thanks.
Demonstrate that this is